Hi, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Tony Shaffer, President of the London Center for Policy Research, and welcome to another edition of Thought to Action, where we dive deeply into key issues which will help you understand more comprehensively the challenges that we face every day, making you essentially a better leader and a better person who understands how to influence things around you in an effective way. You can find us on Rumble, LinkedIn, Twitter, Getter, YouTube, all the different social media sites. And I'm supposed to remind you that we now have a Teespring shop where you can buy some of our great gear. We're going to be gearing up, so to speak, getting stuff out there for you all to help support us by purchasing the gear that we have there. So I want you all to go check that out. And again, more to come on that. So today, we're going to go into an area where we've covered a little bit already through our World Economic Forum discussions. We've had something called the Great Reset Roundtable, which has gone through and explored some of the real evils, and I do mean evils, of the ideas behind Build Back Better. You will own nothing and be happy. I think we've heard that before, 1917 Russia. So I think we need to all be more prepared to deal with the challenges we have coming regarding that, and of course the economy. Today, as we speak, as we tape this, the interest rate, the inflation rate is now 8%, and this is pre-Putin's war with Ukraine. 8% interest, 7.9, and it's not going to get any better. Everyday Americans are suffering because of hugely bad economic policy. So today we're being joined by Geeta Chopra. She is an instructor on economics. She has a great deal of practical information to share with us. She's also an author. We're going to let her talk about her book a little bit. She also has her own show, We the People, the Geeta Chopra Show, with an exclamation point, which I like the exclamation point. We have not worked up to having one of those yet, but we hope to have one of those someday. So without further ado, Geeta, welcome to Thought to Action.
Yes, no, I'm glad to be here today. It's a pleasure, and I'm excited to have a very powerful discussion with you.
So one of the reasons I've asked you to come on with this is because I, for one, am not an economist. I have a fundamental, I don't want to say I don't like economics, because they're for the most part a fairly difficult subject, but a lot of us do find it a bit of a challenge to follow. So I appreciate people like you who have taken the time to learn it. And I think that's where we want to go through today, because there's several areas that I think people could look at for themselves once they understand why it's important. So we'll walk through that today. So one of the first things that we're going to go through, and you'll see it on the screen as we put things up and go, is the unemployment trend graph. One of the things you brought up before you wanted to talk about is this issue. Now, I would argue, not even being an economist or anyone with a background in this, since you do instruct this, is that the basic measurements for economic health have changed dramatically since the 1980s. What I would argue right now, we're seeing quote unquote 8% inflation. I think it's closer to 20 if you actually use the 1980 index for doing that. So let's talk a little bit about employment trend graph from 80 to 2017. So go ahead and tell us why that's important to get into this first off.
Yes, sure. And as you said, Tony, there's a number of issues going on in the country right now, which are economically devastating.
Yeah.
If you want to isolate unemployment, we can take a look at that. And if we actually look at a graph, we can see that it was high, it goes high and low, just like any other economic graph and trend.
Right.
Look and see during the Obama eras, from 2009 onwards, it was at an all-time high at about 9%. And I believe that the African American unemployment rate was 8+% at the time.
Right. Right.
And then when Donald Trump took office, and it went down to around 5%. If you actually look at the graph, it's basically crashing downwards. And 2019 at an all-time low, and again, I'm just going to isolate the African-American population, was 5.4%.
Wow.
So but this is really important for the layperson to understand. And I like how you put it, that maybe not everyone out there is an economist or even likes economics. But again, we must understand who we're voting for and what we're voting for. A lot of it comes back to common sense.
So that's a great point. I mean, this is one of the things I've said as a Trump campaign advisor. While this was not my area, I worked with several folks who did work this. One of the frustrating points is that no matter how much we would promote factual evidence of the Trump economic success, the left would essentially make excuses why that's not important. And so let's jump right into the other issue that relates to this, essentially, is the demographic issue. I've said to a number of folks that I find that minority groups tend to vote against their own self-interest. And I think this graph that you're showing us here, we're talking about, is a great example of that, where the African American community was benefiting greatly from the economic power, the success, the growing income, the growing, expanding economy, which benefited everybody. They benefited as one of the big groups. You've talked about your community. I've mentioned before to others the Jewish community. Why is it, Gita, that so many minority communities tend to vote against their own self-interest? The self-interest being promulgating success, promulgating, electing people who will actually emulate the best practices to create an economic atmosphere of opportunity. Why is it that we see this failure to vote for the right people?
And that's a great question, Tony, and there is an answer to that. And I'm just going to give you the answer directly, then I'll attempt to explain and rationalize it out if that's possible. But it's the race card. Okay, so it's the race card. So as you can see, I am a person of color. Now, being brought up and raised in the United States, I'm not an immigrant to the United States, but when we have immigrants coming to the United States and they are of color, there tends to be a self-consciousness associated with that. And what happens, and that's completely normal, of course, if we go to a foreign country, we might feel out of place in the beginning as well. So again, this is the human tendency, and the Democratic Party tends to take these people on and act as the poster child for the person of color or for the immigrant community in America. And of course, therefore, Republicans are by default racist and the white man's club. And again, being raised in the United States, understanding the Constitution, being educated in the institutions, I know the truth and therefore I'm free. So, this is a big problem. And again, you mentioned about unemployment. I did talk about the African American community, but it's all for one for all. When Donald Trump was in office in his peak years of doing really well and we had high GDP, the whole country benefited.
Right.
And who would not vote for that? Who doesn't want to have a healthy job with high disposable income? It benefits everyone. So again, I am ashamed of my community because they are an educated people who come from India, mostly doctors and the highest tax income earners, and they're socially conservative, okay, they're fiscally conservative, but they're voting for the party that basically murders them. Okay? And I'm going down to everything, including abortions. They don't do any of those policies. So this is shameful, and that's why I wrote the book, to talk about these issues and address them. And that's why I'm vocal about it, because I just believe that it's unawareness, it's ignorance and unawareness. And it's an extended effort on the Democratic Party's part to basically lie to these people who are coming to a country and they don't know better and they fall for it because they're already weak when they come.
So I often remind people, and it probably was one of the factors that got me booted off Twitter permanently, just saying. I used to always remind people on Twitter that the Democrats are the party of the Trail of Tears, of the Confederacy, of slavery, of Jim Crow, anti-woman suffrage, Japanese American internment. It's like, I don't fundamentally believe they've changed all that much since, and I'm going to say this, the only man I've ever met that had an affiliation with any Klansman is Joe Biden. I've met Joe several times. I testified before him, and he was mentored by a grand cyclops of the KKK in the form of Senator Byrd. I was just reviewing a picture of the two of them together. So it's kind of interesting if you actually look at who they are and don't listen to the rhetoric, they're not a good party. And this is, again, why I've always been mystified by this. I've essentially been a Reagan Republican since I was 18, just because it just seemed like it was a common sense thing to me to do. And so this is where, how do you get people to think for themselves? Because as a very young 18-year-old, I'll never forget, I listened to the debate between Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan, and Reagan said, "Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? If you're not better off, then if you're better off, vote for Jimmy Carter. If you're not better off, vote for me." That's kind of like my bottom line. If you're not better off, then why would you reelect someone who's not going to support your interests. So how do you go about trying to educate people in your own community and other communities about the reality which we face rather than the one that the left projects constantly?
Right. Yeah. And these are some great thoughts. And the word that came into my mind is basically it's uneducated. And I don't mean that in the sense that they've quit school or anything. It's just that, again, they haven't read, they don't know the facts. You said it, Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. Okay?
Right.
We know that because we live in the US. So if you're going to immigrate to the country, just be more aware, learn more, read more, find the truth. And one such way is to turn off CNN, turn off the liberal media, because they'll just have you going down a certain path, which leads to destruction. So and these are people, again, who most immigrants who come to America are well educated. They are well read. They're very hard workers. And again, I'll speak for my community, having visited India many times.
Right.
It's life or death there to pass through school, to do well, to earn well, to provide for your family. So these are people who have potential. There is hope. And that's why, again, I wrote the book just to spread the message. They're just being misinformed, right? And they're then perpetuating that down to the next generation. It's a generational curse. And now we see in the United States that many South Asians are rising up. They are becoming aware and they are running for the right office in sync with their values. I interviewed Dinesh D'Souza on my show, and he mentioned something that in general, the South Asian community tends to be a voiceless community, a weaker, timid people. Maybe we're not as outspoken as we are, but we need to be. We need to speak for ourselves. We need to not just come to America to fit in. And I'm speaking to the immigrant community. Vote for your values. Don't come here.
That's a great saying. Vote for your values. Wow. Yeah, exactly.
Yes. They left India for these very reasons, right? For socialism, for communism, for food rationing, for poverty. And they're against big government. If you actually go to India, all the private banks, everybody knows you send your kids to a private school in India. Everyone knows you put your money in a private bank. Everyone knows you don't deal with government institutions. You always go to the private sector. That's a known thing in the culture. But when they come here, they believe in socialism, the big bureaucracy, the welfare state. So it doesn't really make sense. There's a disconnect there. And I blame the Democratic Party for victimizing these people. They're generationally victimized.
I'm with you. Look, I've said this often. I don't believe for a minute that the state helping people, picking winners and losers, does anything except amalgamate control for politicians, allow them to use your money for their benefit. That's all it does. It doesn't benefit individuals. So I'm glad you put it in that framework. So speaking of that framework, let's get on with some of the other economic points I'd like to have you run through with us. So one of the other things that we want to talk about a little bit here is the Federal Reserve comfort zone. Full disclosure, I used to advise the Federal Reserve. I was on a team that advised how to maintain their basically their infrastructure security. With that said, I wasn't involved in monetary policy, just saying. So let's talk a little bit about that comfort zone and the inflation. And I would argue from this quantitative easing, all that is basically devaluing money and your savings. Is that a correct interpretation, Gita?
Yeah, that's right. So quantitative easing, now they've had to do that for the last 2 years, fine. There was a pandemic, perhaps we can overlook that. But if you're going to keep lowering interest rates, you're basically going to devalue your currency and your exchange rate in the international marketplace. So, we have two issues going on right now. So one is high inflation, which is at a 40-year high.
Right.
So even November, it was 6.5, December 6.8, January 7.5, and now it's up to 7.9 in February with the last numbers. So obviously it's growing. Okay, so on one hand it's growing, but it's already high. And some again might argue and say, well, there's supply chain shortages because of the pandemic. But look, I like to get to the root of things, Tony, and this is what I do in my economics class with my students. We look at graphs, we look at charts, and then we make a decision. So I'd like to believe my students are informed, and I wish the rest of America was informed when they vote. But again, when you're printing money, the numbers speak for themselves. So it's not just about the pandemic. It's about going out on a shopping spree and then weaponizing the IRS to make the rich pay. It doesn't work that way. Yeah. Everyone knows how the law of supply and law of demand. When we have too much of something, it becomes worth less. When we don't have enough of something, there's a shortage and the price rises. So he's printing money and now it's becoming worth less. And there's more dollars chasing the same amount of goods. And that's what has led to inflation. Okay, so that's one part of it. And then we have the part where we're handing out free lunches. I'm not saying not to help people in the pandemic. Sure, we had stimulus checks, but it's designed to get people up and out, not down and under to stay in forever. So when people aren't going to work, when there's a free lunch, obviously we have a labor shortage. So now we have wage inflation. And when we have wage inflation, that just exacerbates the supply chain shortages, which then in turn increases the prices that you and I pay for goods. All right. And then we have oil and gas, which we can address after. That just creates overall inflation. So he's getting inflation hit hard from all three sides, and it's not because of the pandemic. And we haven't addressed Ukraine yet.
So we'll probably have to address it another day because we're going to
Yes.
be hitting a lot of this other stuff. But one of the things I've noticed, and I've studied the Weimar Republic, the German Republic, right before Hitler came to power. And a lot of the same economic bad decisions you're talking about were made by the German government. High inflation based on the lowering value of currency. And by the way, Germany, the people of Germany were very capable. There was a great deal of manpower available. They didn't use it properly. They had a great deal of energy. Back in those days, coal was king, had huge coal resources. They were mismanaged. So it wasn't about the German people not being able to work. It wasn't about energy not being available. It was about the monetary policies, which actually ruined Germany. And I would argue, Gita, we're making the same basic mistakes right now in many ways. Is that a dramatic statement for me to make, or?
No, it's, there's nothing surprising anymore given what's been going on. It's just been 2 years of damage. I'm surprised at what he's been able to do in this short a time. And then we have 2 years left. But, and coming back to what you said about the Feds, yes, they like their comfort zones, which means that our comfort zone should be 1 to 3% inflation.
Right.
Some inflation is healthy. You want your house price to go up. You want to get a little bit of a promotion at work.
No doubt.
But if we're talking about, double digits, we're approaching 10%. That reminds me of Russia when the ruble was crumbling. Where's our currency going? I don't know that we're going to be the US dollar is going to be the reserve currency anymore in the world. This is becoming a serious problem, and we're basically setting ourselves up to go in this direction. So this is, again, why we have to encourage people to really pay attention to who you're voting for and what's going on, because this is just the grassroots of what's happening. Right. This high inflation, yes, it will lead to, it's going to affect you directly, whoever's watching this program.
So, the last two things I want to bring up kind of related to each other, we've kind of gone through and outlined all this, is the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, and money supply, because they're related directly. And can you talk a little bit about that? Just kind of like why this is something that we need to pay attention to, and how this has been badly affected over the past 2 years.
Sure, and anyone who's alive out there is affected by the CPI. So that's basically the Consumer Price Index. It's a basket of goods. It's about 30,000 goods, and it's broad-based into 8 categories. So we have housing, food, transportation, apparel, oil, and energy. So we just see what percent these go up on an annual and a monthly basis. Okay, so these numbers are very off right now. And again, the reason for that is because of the supply chain shortages, which again relates back to the printing of money and handing out a free stimulus. So this is going to be a problem in the future if it continues to grow. And when you print money, I know he had I believe he had a $2.5 trillion bill, which he's tried to push through Congress, the infrastructure for all these things. We don't have money for certain things. And again, this is very important. People don't realize that, and they say, well, we need new bridges. We can't keep printing money. If you come back to an economic perspective, the more you have of something, it becomes worth less. And who is paying for this? The taxpayers are paying for this. So it's basically the budgets are all, none of them are balanced. Everything's in disarray from an economic perspective. Unemployment is at an all-time high. Inflation is high. So he's kind of getting hit hard on every angle right now. So I don't even know how to attempt to navigate this problem, but I would say stop spending, and at least so we can have wage inflation go back down to normal so people can start getting jobs again as well. Stop the stimulus. So basically undo everything he's done would be the recipe for success at this point.
Wow. Well, I agree with you. So one of the things that was notable during my time advising President Trump and the Trump campaign and his folks was my colleague, Steve Moore. Steve Moore was one of his economic advisors. And Gita, one of the things that President Trump did join was the economic health of the United States was linked directly to national security. The first president the idea of a reasonably healthy economy growing at a rate that helps benefit American people without a great deal of inflation. Some inflation is necessary. I think that's a good discussion point. And maybe even, I'd like to propose maybe, I don't know if you'd be willing to come back. I'd like to have you and Steve Moore come back. Steve being, again, a President Trump advisor on this, as well as someone I worked with. Maybe we could discuss in greater detail what you just said, because I don't think people understand the evil that is created by having all of these failures of policy to result in low growth. Low growth combined with high inflation and high unemployment caused by the government printing money. And I've said, this may be a radical concept, maybe not. I think we should stop having to pay taxes because there's no link to the money we pay to the expenditures of the government. The appropriation process by Congress has nothing to do with our paying taxes. And I would argue at this point, they don't need our money. It's simply a tool designed to suppress our economic ability. And I know it's very libertarian, but that's kind of the reality. They've long ago abandoned the idea of linking income to expenditures. I mean, am I right on this? I mean, I'm just a layman here looking back at this stuff.
Well, that's very disheartening if that's true. I don't really know what's going on in Congress, but again, I'm not surprised, and I would just describe our current state as socialism.
Yeah.
I mean, call it what it is. I don't want to, we have to be honest here. This is socialism. So for those who are planning to vote for Joe Biden in the next election, you are voting for socialism, and that's fine, but just be aware of what's going on. Like you said, they're spending your money, you don't know what they're spending it on, and these government programs don't benefit anyone. So you're basically increasing the size of the welfare state.
Yeah, no, that's the danger. So with that said, since we've talked about so much today regarding all these issues, it's in your book. Tell us about your book a little bit.
Sure, thank you. And it was a pleasure to be here. And my book basically describes everything that we talked about, a little bit about the economic legacy, about Donald Trump. I do address where a lot of the ignorance comes from. I highlight a lot of his accomplishments. And I also had a vision of him, which God gave me, which I shared in the book. So I think the whole world should see that. But again, it just really addresses the problems that we're having right now and how we got here and how to prevent this in the future by being informed. So you can get a copy of my book on Amazon.
Now, what's the title again?
My Public Letter to Donald Trump.
That's good. And so he better pay attention, just saying,
Yes, it's for him.
Yeah. So, well, I mean, if it's a public letter, my goodness sake, he better find a way to pick up on it and actually internalize it. But that's part of the point. And Gita, we've talked about this before, is that I think President Trump has to understand that he touched people in a way that maybe he doesn't fully comprehend. And by simply, I think, being Donald Trump, and I know a lot of people who just don't like the mean tweets, and that's fine, whatever. But I think the great effect that he had on the economy of actually uplifting minority communities needs to be the focus of any discussion regarding the Trump policies. And I
spoke to that.
Yeah, and I appreciate you taking the time to actually document that. So that's it for today. Thank you all for joining Thought to Action, where we obviously go into deep issues of importance that I'd like to believe that we can, I don't necessarily believe we can simplify, but I think we can allow for a better understanding of why you all need to be paying attention to it. So our guest today has been Geeta Chopra. Be sure and check out her new book, her letter to President Trump, which I think is a great work. I haven't seen it yet, but I will. I'm going to read it and I'll get back to you on that. And Geeta, I'd like to have you back at some point. As I mentioned, we actually have the Great Reset Roundtable, where we can get into a deeper discussion of why this is happening. I don't believe Biden is doing this in a vacuum. I think there's a larger global effort driven by the World Economic Forum. As they say, you will own nothing and be happy. Yeah, I'm sure I'm looking forward to that. As is all millennials, since all millennials live in their basements, right? And with their parents? No, I'm just kidding. My son's a millennial and he's a fireman, so God bless him. But I think we have to recognize that the opportunity is through individual greatness, growing the economy through our essentially freedom, through the free market, not through this socialistic ideal that somehow the government can be the arbitrator of both benefit and ill. As a matter of fact, Gita, one of the things we want to talk about is this social credit system that China is using, that I believe is the foundation of what they want to bring here via the World Economic Forum and what the Biden administration is pushing for. So I hope you'll consider coming back for that.
Absolutely, and I did address China in my book as well. A lot of unfair trade practices, lots to be said. I'd be happy to come back.
Excellent. All right, and again, thank you all for joining us today. Check us out on YouTube, Gitter, Facebook, all these things, all the different social media we're on out there. And I think you'll enjoy our Patreon. We will put on Patreon a lot of special content to include participation in our Ask Us Anything sessions, where we go through and answer your questions. And it's a real hoot to watch us answer your questions. Everybody likes that. And obviously we have a Teespring store now that we're doing things in a wider range of groups and messages. Be sure and check it out. We're going to have more content, more good stuff available to buy. T-shirts, hats, all that stuff's coming. So be sure and check it out. Anyway, that's all I have today. Thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you again real soon.